Today's true story is a bit different. Listen carefully. History is often written by the victors, a polished narrative of those who wore the crowns or led the armies. But buried beneath the heavy dust of the American archives lies a name that was nearly erased. A man whose ambition was so vast, so radical, that it terrified the very foundations of the United States government. He didn't just want freedom, he wanted a kingdom for his people. His name was Edward P. McCabe. The nightmare of post-Civil War America. To understand the man, we must first understand the fire in which he was forged. The year was 1865. The American Civil War had ended. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and the fragile hope of a new beginning. 4 million African Americans, once shackled as property, were suddenly declared free. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the American dream was finally open to everyone. But that dream was a mirage. As the sun set on the 19th century, a dark cloud descended over the American South. The era known as Reconstruction was failing. The white supremacist establishment, unable to accept a world where their former slaves were their equals, retaliated with a vengeance. They gave birth to the Jim Crow laws, a systemic machine designed to strip away black dignity. Black men were hunted. Literacy tests and poll taxes made the right to vote a death sentence. Public lynchings became a horrific form of entertainment. The message was clear: you are free to breathe, but you are not free to live. In this atmosphere of terror, the black community was faced with a desperate question. Where do we go? Is there any corner of this earth where we can truly be safe? The rise of a visionary. Enter Edward P. McCabe. Born in 1850 in Troy, New York, McCabe was not a man of violence, but a man of immense intellectual gravity. He was sharp, educated, and possessed a political mind that operated several moves ahead of his enemies. By the time he reached his 30s, he had seen enough. He realized that as long as white men held the gavel and the gun, black people would remain permanent refugees in their own country. McCabe didn't want to beg for civil rights. He didn't want to ask for permission to exist. He had a different idea, a forbidden idea. He thought, why fight for a seat at a table where we are hated? Why not build our own table in our own house under our own roof? Oklahoma, the promised land. McCabe turned his gaze towards the west, specifically to the Oklahoma Territory. In the late 1880s, Oklahoma was an unorganized expanse of wild prairie, often referred to as Indian Territory. To the U.S. government, it was a problem to be settled. To Edward P. McCabe, it was a blank canvas. He envisioned a geopolitical revolution. He didn't just want to build a village, he wanted to create an all-black state. Imagine the audacity of this vision in 1890. McCabe wanted a governor who was black, where the judges were black, where the sheriffs carried badges to protect black lives, and where black wealth could grow without the threat of being burned down. He wanted to turn Oklahoma into a sovereign sanctuary, a black empire within the United States. To the white politicians in Washington, D.C., this was the ultimate threat. A black state would mean black senators, black congressmen, and a shift in the balance of power that could change America forever. It was a dream so dangerous that it had to be stopped. But McCabe was already moving. He packed his printing press, sold his belongings, and headed into the wilderness. He was about to launch the greatest migration in American history, a journey towards a dream that history almost forgot. Edward P. McCabe knew that a dream without people is just a ghost. To build a state, he needed an army of settlers. But he didn't use guns to recruit them. He used the most powerful weapon of the 19th century, the printing press. The Langston City Herald. In 1890, in the middle of the untamed Oklahoma prairie, McCabe founded a town and named it Langston City after John Mercer Langston, the first African-American elected to Congress. But Langston was more than just a cluster of wooden shacks. It was the headquarters of a revolution. McCabe established a newspaper called the Langston City Herald. He didn't just report the news, he wrote manifestos. He sent thousands of copies of this paper across the Deep South, into the plantations of Mississippi, the cabins of Alabama, and the terror-filled streets of Georgia. The message was electrifying. Come to Oklahoma. Here you can breathe. Here you can own the land beneath your feet. In Langston, there are no masters, only neighbors. The Great Migration. The response was overwhelming. For thousands of black families, McCabe's words were a gospel of salvation. They sold their livestock, packed their Bibles and cast iron stoves into wagons, and began the Great Exodus. They weren't just moving to a new town, they were escaping a war zone. They traveled through hostile territories where white mobs tried to block the roads and trains. Many were threatened with death if they didn't return to the cotton fields. Yet they kept coming. Within a few short years, over 7,000 settlers arrived in Langston alone. Across Oklahoma, nearly 30 all-black towns began to sprout from the earth like wildflowers after a storm. Towns like Boley, Clearview, and Rentisville became symbols of black excellence. A society without a ceiling. In Langston, for the first time in their lives, these former slaves saw a world through a different lens. They saw a black postmaster. They saw black bankers lending money to black farmers. They saw children walking to schools where the teachers looked like them and believed in their brilliance. McCabe was the architect of it all. He wasn't just a mayor, he was a kingmaker. He began to organize these settlers into a voting bloc. He realized that if he could get enough black voters into the territory before Oklahoma became a state, they could control the Constitutional Convention. The meeting at the White House. McCabe's influence grew so large that he could no longer be ignored by the federal government. In a move that shocked the American political establishment, Edward P. McCabe traveled to Washington, D.C. He walked into the White House to meet with President Benjamin Harrison. His demand was simple but earth-shattering: appoint me as the governor of the Oklahoma Territory. If the president agreed, it would mean the first black governor in American history leading a territory that was rapidly becoming a black stronghold. It was the closest the United States ever came to having a state truly governed by the descendants of slaves. The dream was at its peak. Langston was booming, the people were armed with hope, and the gates of the all-black state were swinging open. But as McCabe stood on the threshold of history, the forces of shadow were preparing a counterstrike that would be as silent as it was deadly.
Success has many friends, but for a black man in 19th century America, success was a target. As Langston City flourished and the all-black state movement gained momentum, a wave of panic swept through the white political establishment. They realized that Edward P. McCabe wasn't just building a town, he was building a power base that threatened the very concept of white supremacy in the West. The White Backlash. The reaction was swift and vitriolic. White settlers in the surrounding territories began to arm themselves. Rumors were spread through white-owned newspapers that McCabe was planning a black uprising. The narrative was flipped. A man seeking safety was branded a seeker of war. Politicians in Washington, D.C. began to receive frantic letters. The message was always the same: if Oklahoma becomes a black state, we will lose the West. The dream of a sovereign black sanctuary was being framed as a national security threat. The betrayal in Washington. Remember McCabe's meeting at the White House? While President Benjamin Harrison listened, the political machinery behind him was already working to ensure McCabe would never hold the governor's seat. Instead of appointing McCabe, the administration began to stall. They realized that if they granted Oklahoma statehood too early, McCabe's voting bloc would dominate. So, they changed the rules of the game. They began to redraw the territorial lines. They encouraged a massive influx of white settlers through land runs, giving away free land to white families while making it increasingly difficult for black families to secure titles. The legislative noose. As the 1890s progressed, the legal climate turned deadly. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, institutionalized separate but equal, giving Oklahoma the green light to enforce segregation. Suddenly, the all-black towns that McCabe had built as havens were being surrounded by a legal noose. The territorial legislature passed laws that made it nearly impossible for these towns to collect taxes or govern themselves. They were being starved out, economically and politically. The 1907 statehood disaster. The final blow came in 1907. Oklahoma was finally granted statehood, but it wasn't the state McCabe had envisioned. To secure statehood, the white leaders of the territory had to prove they could control the black population. The very first act of the new Oklahoma state legislature, Senate Bill 1, was a Jim Crow law.
It mandated segregation on trains and in public spaces. The dream of a black state died on the floor of the legislature that day. McCabe, who had spent nearly 2 decades and his entire fortune building this vision, watched as the state he helped create turned into a fortress of the very racism he had tried to escape.
Watching a dream die is a slow, agonizing process. For Edward P. McCabe, the year 1907 wasn't just a political defeat, it was a personal catastrophe. He had poured his soul, his reputation, and every cent of his wealth into the red soil of Oklahoma. Now, that same soil was being governed by men who viewed him as a threat to be erased. The erasure of power. With the passage of Senate Bill 1 and the formalization of Jim Crow in Oklahoma, McCabe's political influence vanished almost overnight. The Republican Party, which he had served so loyally for decades, turned its back on him. They no longer needed a powerful black organizer. They needed to appease the new white majority of the state. McCabe found himself a stranger in the very towns he had built. The all-black towns were being choked. Without state support, banks began to fail. Black farmers were denied loans. The economic mecca that McCabe had promised was being starved by a system that refused to let black excellence exist outside of white control. The final stand in Oklahoma. McCabe didn't leave immediately. He stayed and fought. He used his remaining resources to file lawsuits against the new segregation laws. He argued that the state was violating the very constitution it had just signed, but the courts were no longer interested in the rights of black pioneers. By 1908, the Black State movement was effectively dead. The thousands of families who had followed McCabe to the Promised Land were now trapped in a state that was, in many ways, more hostile than the ones they had fled. The weight of their disappointment began to press down on McCabe. He wasn't just a leader anymore. He was a man who felt the burden of thousands of broken lives. The move to Chicago. In a move that signaled the end of an era, Edward P. McCabe packed his bags once more. But this time, there was no newspaper to announce his arrival. There was no great exodus following him. He left Oklahoma, the land of his forbidden dream, and moved to Chicago. Chicago was the rising hub for black Americans, but for McCabe, it was a place of exile. He took a job as a clerk in the Cook County Auditor's office. Imagine that. The man who had sat with presidents, the man who had founded cities and almost governed a state, was now quietly filing papers in a dimly lit office. The silent years. The fire that had once burned in McCabe's eyes began to fade into a quiet, dignified resignation. He lived a modest life, far from the headlines of the Langston City Herald. His health began to decline. The world was moving on. The Harlem Renaissance was beginning to bloom in New York, and a new generation of leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey were taking the stage. But these new leaders stood on a foundation that McCabe had helped build, even if they didn't know his name. He was the architect of black self-determination, a man who had tried to build a nation before the world was ready to let him.
Edward P. McCabe died in the shadows, but dreams of that magnitude never truly stay buried. They seep into the soil. They linger in the architecture of forgotten streets. They echo in the stories told by grandmothers on porches in the quiet corners of Oklahoma. The survival of the all-black towns. Today, out of the more than 50 all-black towns that once dotted the Oklahoma Territory, 13 still remain. Towns like Boley, Langston, and Taft are not just dots on a map. They are living monuments to a defiance that refuse to break. When you walk down the streets of Langston today, you see Langston University, the only historically black college in the state. This university was part of the compromise McCabe fought for. It stands as a testament to his belief that education was the ultimate fortress of freedom. While the black state never materialized, the intellectual and cultural seeds planted by McCabe settlers blossomed into some of the most resilient communities in American history. Why history forgot McCabe? You might ask yourself, why didn't I learn this in school? The erasure of Edward P. McCabe was not an accident. To teach the story of the all-black state is to admit that black Americans weren't just victims of history, they were architects of it. It forces us to acknowledge that the segregation and poverty we see today were not natural outcomes, but the results of deliberate political sabotage. McCabe's story was forbidden because it proved that black people were capable of total self-governance, economic independence, and immense political organization within decades of being enslaved. His story was buried because it challenged the myth that the American West was won only by white pioneers in cowboy hats. The ghost of the 51st state. What if McCabe had succeeded?
It is one of the greatest what-ifs in history. Imagine a 51st state where the political culture was rooted in the liberation of the formerly oppressed. Imagine the impact on the civil rights movement if there had been a sovereign black power base in the heart of the country 40 years before Martin Luther King Jr. ever marched on Washington. The forbidden dream of Edward P. McCabe remains a blueprint. It reminds us that when a system refuses to give you a seat at the table, the most revolutionary act you can perform is to build your own house.